I want to talk this evening about the nature of the soul and how we can know that there is such a thing as a soul. And we have a problem because we've lost the soul in Western culture. And not only have we lost the soul in Western culture, but we've lost the soul in the church. People, by and large, in Christianity today have very little understanding what a soul is or why one ought to believe in a soul. And one of the great evidences for this happens when you share with people that dogs and cats and lions and tigers and bears and animals have souls. Now, the very first thing that happens is that people are shocked to hear this in the church. Now, not outside the church. They think you're crazy. But people in the church are shocked to hear this. And then when I share with them the fact that almost all Christian thinkers, at least up until the 18th century, and even the vast majority of them up until this century believed that animals had souls, it just comes as a real shock. Now, the very first thing that people always want to know when you say that animals have souls indicates how little people understand the soul. And they always want to ask, do you mean that animals go to heaven when they die? Now what is sad about the question is not that people care about animals. My own answer to that question is probably no. Could be wrong on that. It's not a clear question, but probably the animal soul ceases to exist when the animal dies. Might be wrong on it, but that's probably the case. But what is troubling about the question is that for many followers of Jesus Christ, the only thing a soul does for them is be what goes to heaven when they die. And there's no other work for a soul to do. Now, what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about the nature of the soul and how we know we have one today. I want to begin by just giving you a very brief take on why we've lost belief in the soul today. So let me just say something very briefly about that. In what was called the Enlightenment, sometimes it's called the period of modernity or the modern period. And it's always hard to give dates on these, but I would say probably the 17th through the end of the 19th century. We can just call this the period of modernity. We have, in the beginning of the modern period, the writings of René Descartes. I think if you had to date the modern era, Descartes in his writings would be the beginnings of the period of modernity. And other thinkers of the modern period would be people like John Locke and David Hume and Immanuel Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes, and people of that sort. These are perhaps names that you're to greater or lesser degrees familiar with, but you've heard these names in any case. And the period of modernity, I think, was about 80% correct. My own view is that I am both pre-modern and modern. The modern period is being beaten up on a lot today, and I think that the modernists got about 80% of the core of modernity right. But one thing that happened that was a problem with the development of modernism that had nothing essentially to do with modernism itself, but still was the way modernism developed, was that it became a view in which knowledge equals what we might call mathematical physics plus sensations. Now, for those of you more familiar with philosophy, there was nothing in the modernist era that made it have to develop this way, but it did develop this way. When I talk about the core, its development being toward mathematical physics plus sensations, basically what I mean is that to know something means that you've got to be able to have a sense experience of it. You've got to be able to see it, touch it, taste it, smell it, or hear it. And you've got to be able to represent it with a mathematical model. Okay? So to know something means that you've got to be able to interact with it by way of the five senses, and you need to be able to represent the object with mathematics. And so this became roughly identified with the view that the hard sciences are the only things that give us knowledge about the world. You understand that? And so what you have then is the idea that we're our brains, because you can have sense experiences of the brain. You can weigh it. You can stick things in it and see what it'll do. You can represent the workings of the brain mathematically through chemical and physical processes and so on. And so the idea begins to surface from this particular historical trajectory of modernism. The idea surfaces that animals and humans are their brains and bodies. And so what we get is something called physicalism. And as a result, the soul simply begins to drop out of attention. Now the hardest place for this to sell, among other things, is psychology. And it's almost impossible, really, to be a psychologist and not believe in the soul, even though most psychologists don't think they believe in the soul. So what psychologists have done is started studying the self instead of the soul. They call it the self. Turns out the self is just another word for the soul in most models of the self. But even in psychology, with the coming of B.F. Skinner and even up to the present time, you have an emphasis placed on behavior in the brain and that sort of thing. Now, in this century, I would say, it's hard to date these things, but if I had to date it, I'd say probably the late 50s. What we have is a split and a reaction to modernity in terms of what is now called postmodernism. Postmodernism. And postmodernism is a complicated phenomenon. The major streams of postmodernism are the philosopher Derrida and Ludwig Wittgenstein. But by and large, postmodernism, for our purposes, is just a form of relativism. According to postmodernism, everything's relative. Now, the important thing about postmodernism for my lecture this evening is that according to postmodernists, there is no self. For the postmodernist, the self, and I'll put that in quotes, is a construction of culture. So, in other words, in a certain cultural context, I am a professorial self. In another context, I am a father self. In another context, I might be a consumer self or whatever. And I might have as many selves as there are subcultures I'm a part of. And whatever self you have is nothing but a creation of the cultural group you're a part of. And there is no true self that's the real you. So on this view, then, there is no soul either. Primarily because there's no real world on the postmodernist view, and souls, are, if they're real, are disgustingly a part of the real world. So what we have then is, we have the two major intellectual movements of our generation denying the reality of the soul. Now, as I hope to show you before the evening is over with, one thing that follows from both of these is that it becomes very difficult to leave room for moral responsibility once the soul is denied. And interestingly enough, one of the main problems of our culture today is moral action and moral responsibility. And so it's important for you and for me to understand what the soul is and how we can know we have one, for many reasons, but not the least of which is to have a way of understanding what we believe and not to be trapped into one of these approaches. Now, one other thing I'll say, and that is that as another part of this movement, we have evolutionary theory. And if evolution is true and there isn't a God, then it's likely that there's no such thing as a soul. Can you think of why that would be? If there's no God and evolution is the correct account of how you and I got here, just stop and think for a minute, and don't raise your hand, but just ponder the question for a second. Why would this most naturally imply that there is no such thing as a mind or soul or anything like that, anything that's immaterial? Well, the basic reason was one that Darwin himself pointed out, namely that what comes from matter by simply rearranging matter will itself just be a more complicated form of matter. So if you start with material objects and you apply forces and causes to them, whether it's light or what have you, and they rearrange, what you'll end up getting is a more complicated form of matter. You will not get something completely different from matter coming from simply rearranging atoms and molecules and that sort of thing. So Darwin made the point that if there's anything true of living organisms that cannot be explained by evolutionary theory, then probably the best explanation of that particular part, he worried a lot about the eye, would be that God made it. And if God made the eye, we might as well bite the bullet, said Darwin, and admit he made the liver and the heart and all the rest of it. Because once the camel's nose is under the tent, the game is up. And particularly difficult in this regard is the mind or the soul. And Paul Churchland at the University of California at San Diego has just said flat out that because evolution is how we got here and there is no God, there is no room or need for anything like a mind to exist. So, I think that one of the great arguments against the adequacy of evolutionary theory is the existence of the soul of the mind. So these are just background issues now, and maybe we could take about just two, I'll take two, maybe at the most three comments at this point before we move on, but perhaps you'd like to just to raise something just at the beginning here. Yes, sir. Just two or three of you. Yes, sir.
Could you clarify the point about the matter being more complicated?
Okay. Would I re-clarify the point about matter being more complicated? If you take an electron and a proton and put them together, you'll get a hydrogen atom. And the electron and the proton are strictly physical objects before they're put together. When you put them together, the hydrogen atom is a strictly physical object, though it's more complicated in its arrangement. Now, the same will hold for carbon atoms and oxygen and silicon, and then we get methane and proteins and all the rest of it. So the only thing that happens when you take matter and rearrange it into more complicated forms of matter on this view is that you just get a more complicated structural physical object. But you can't get something immaterial out of that because that's almost getting something from nothing, is basically how the idea goes. Yeah, matter can only give rise to matter. Yes, sir. Yeah, I'm going to say something about that later, but I did do that intentionally. But I'll make a comment about it in a minute. Thanks for pointing out. One more. Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay, it's a real conflict with my theory, and he said because the main reason was because Greg backed up. I mean, if Greg backed it up, so I just wanted to. I know that. I'm sorry. I was just playing with it. No, if you'll give me a chance later on, what I'll try to do is explain my view of how the mind and the soul and the spirit relate, because I do believe that there are three different entities, and I'll do the best I can to explain how they interact with one another. All right. What I would like to do this evening is three things. for the rest of our time. Number one, give you some preliminary distinctions that will help you understand parts 2 and 3. Preliminary distinctions or preliminary ideas that I think we need to have in place so we've got a common vocabulary to understand the second and third parts of our evening together. Part 2, I would like to try to argue for what is called property dualism. And you don't need to know what that means now if you don't. Many of you do, but if you don't, that's all right. The third thing I'd like to argue for would be substance dualism. And so preliminary issues, property dualism, and then substance dualism. Now, to begin with, these are now preliminary. We're going to get into the preliminary issues now. Now, what we're talking about this evening may simply be called the mind-body problem. And the mind-body problem is basically the question of whether you and I are only one kind of thing, let's just say our matter, our body, or our brain. And from now on, I'll just say our brain instead of having to say our body and our brain all the time, okay, for that view. So one view says we're just our brains, and the other view says, no, we have brains all right, but there's something else that's true of us that isn't material, whatever you call it. And these two different views are called physicalism and dualism. Physicalism and dualism. Now, the physicalist says that we are just material objects. We're just complicated physical things. We're brains. That's about it. There are versions of it, but we can't go into that this evening. According to dualism, for our purposes this evening, there are two subgroups of dualism that lay out the options. One is what's called property dualism. And the other is called substance dualism. Okay. Now, for our purposes, for about the next hour and a half, I am going to use mind and soul and spirit interchangeably to mean the same thing. I'm not going to draw a distinction among mind, soul, and spirit. I do that simply for simplicity's sake. It's not because I believe that, but no harm will be done if we will just use these terms interchangeably for right now. Later on, we'll go on and try to draw a distinction. So for right now, by the mind or the soul or the spirit, let's just mean some sort of immaterial something. And we'll clarify further what that immaterial something is as we go along. Now, to get clear on this debate, what we've got to do is to draw a distinction between a property and a substance. Basically, a property is simply an attribute or a quality. A quality or attribute. That's what a property is, a quality or attribute. In English, we typically use we use words that end in NESS or ITY to talk about a property. For example, redness or triangularity would be properties. Roundness, that sort of thing. And a property is just a characteristic that something can have. It's a characteristic that something can have. The negativity of an electron is a property the electron has. A ball could have the property of being round, of being red. That could have the property of weighing 10 pounds. or that sort of thing. So a property is essentially just a characteristic. Now the important thing, and this is key for our purposes, the important thing about a property is that it is always permissible to ask the question, what has it? If you're talking about a property, it will be permissible to ask, what is it that has the property? Okay? Properties are sort of like freshmen. They can be had. And actually these days it's starting to even move up to juniors, but that's another story. So a property is something that can be had. An example would be painfulness. That would be a property. Now, a substance is something that can have a property remain the same through change. A substance is something that can have a property and that can remain the same through change. Let's just for our purposes leave it at that. So, for example, my dog Cody is a substance. He has the property of weighing 15 pounds and being brown, and he could lose the property of being brown and become yellow, and he would still be the same substance. An electron is a substance for our purposes. God is a substance. God is a thing that has properties and that could remain the same through change if he did undergo change. God is a substance. So among his properties are omnipotence, lovableness, mercifulness, kindness, and that sort of thing. It make sense to you? Now, that's a substance. An event is the coming or going of a property by a substance at a point in time, and that'll do for our purposes. An event is the coming or going of a property by a substance at a point in time. So, for example, a leaf's turning red is an event. The property is the coming to be red by the leaf yesterday, or at noon yesterday, or throughout last week. Okay? So events involve the change of properties by things. When you heat water, the boiling of the water is an event. And that event involves, let's just say, the substance water. Let's just use the substance for water. And the property would be the coming to be with the possession of warmth at a certain time. That's an event. Okay. Now, now that these are somewhat clear, we're going to work with these to clarify them more fully for you. But let's get before us now some sort of normal physical properties. Okay? Now, would you be willing to grant that physical objects are objects that possess and only possess physical properties? That is to say, a material object is something where if you were to list all of its properties, they'd all be physical properties. An example would be this podium here. This is a physical object. All of its properties are physical properties. It has a certain size, it has a certain shape, and so on. Now, what is a physical property? Well, that's a good question, but to simplify things, let's just say a physical property is one that is part of the language of chemistry, physics, and related hard sciences like neurophysiology, which involves the study of the brain. Okay? So physical properties are the kinds of properties that physicists and chemists and people who study the brain talk about. For example, a physical property would be being in motion or being at rest. A physical property would be something like having a shape or size. A physical property would be having mass. A physical property would be something like having an electrical charge or magnetic powers or something of that sort. Do you understand that at this point? So now, if you are a physical substance, if you're a physical thing, then everything there is to say about you should be capable of being described in the language of physics and chemistry and brain sciences and that sort of thing. Okay? That's what it would mean to say that you were your brain or you were your body or something of that sort. It just would mean, what that would mean would be that all of the properties that make you you are physical properties. And you don't have any properties that are non-physical. That's what that would mean. Okay? All right. Now, let me give you one more little preliminary, and then I'm going to break you up into groups of 2 or 3 and let you rehearse what we've talked about. And then just to see how it's settling in. And then if we can get a hold of this, then all I need to do is tell you one more preliminary, and we're in the chips. So let me now talk to you about alleged mental properties. I say alleged because these are precisely the things that will be in dispute. And my own view is that all of the things I'm about to tell you are not physical properties, they're mental properties. Now automatically, you should already know at least part of what I mean by that. Part of what I mean by saying that these are not physical properties is that these are not the kinds of properties that you could classify in the language of physics or chemistry or brain sciences or anything like that very easily. And the first example would be what we might call a sensation. A sensation. A sensation is a state of awareness, a state of sentience or awareness. For example, being aware of yellow, or being aware of a smell, or being aware of a taste would be a sensation. There are at least 2 kinds of sensations. The first type of sensation we might call, I'm not pleased with my language here, but I'll just use an empirical sensation. And being the creative teacher that I am, I will classify the second group as a non-empirical sensation. An empirical sensation is a sensation that comes through one of the 5 sense organs. An empirical sensation is a sensation that comes by way of one of the 5 sense organs. So it would be an awareness of, let's say, color or shape, a perceptual awareness, an awareness of smell, an awareness of taste, an awareness of sound, an awareness of texture, as my daughter used to say, smooth, rough, an awareness of texture. Now, a non-empirical sensation will be a state of awareness that doesn't come through one of the five senses. For example, a feeling of pain or a feeling of itchiness would be an example of a non-perceptual sensation. Emotions are, in my opinion, examples of non-empirical sensations. So emotions are cases of sensations here. Second, why don't I just list 5 of these up here, and then we'll talk about them briefly. Thoughts, beliefs, desires, and I'll just put 5 over here. Or sometimes they're called volitions. What is a thought? Well, one of the things that you'll notice about all of these is that I could never tell you what one was if you hadn't had one. This is a very interesting indication of what they are. Another indication of what they are is the only way you can ultimately tell what they are is through introspection. That's another very interesting tip-off. But a thought is basically a content that can be expressed in a sentence which is either true or false. It's a content that can be expressed in a sentence that is either true or false. Now, one of the things you'll notice about it is that you can't see thoughts. The thought expressed by the sentence, "Snow is white," is not the same thing as the sentence. The sentence is something you can see, but it's not the thought. For one reason, the sentence is on the board, but the thought's inside me. Okay? The same thought can be communicated by the sentence "Schnee ist weiß." That expresses the very same thought in a completely different sentence. So thoughts are contents that can be communicated by a sentence, and they are either true or false. It is a thought that is true or false, not a sentence, strictly speaking. A belief is a content that I take to be true. A belief is a content that I take to be true. It too can be expressed in a sentence. So a belief is a content that I take to be true. Beliefs are not the same thing as thoughts. Okay? I have thoughts I don't believe, and I can have beliefs I'm not thinking. I have many beliefs right now about the multiplication tables. I'm not thinking about a single one of them. So I have beliefs I'm not thinking, and you can have thoughts that you don't believe. So they are different things. But you know the difference by simply attending to your own mental taxonomy, as it were. A desire, this is a long subject that I think has tremendous implications, folks. But a desire is not the same thing as a sensation. Desires are not feelings, interestingly enough. And you'll be very confused, by the way, about whether or not you desire to serve God if you confuse desires with feelings. A desire is what we might call an ongoing mental readiness to act. An ongoing mental readiness to act in a certain way. It is a readiness. It's actually a consciously experienced readiness to act. Finally, a volition is an act of will, and a good way to describe a volition is that it is an exercise of power. It is an exercise of power, or I could say in a different way, a purposive or intentional exercise of power. Some philosophers call them endeavorings. And I'll tell you why you want to call an act of will an endeavoring by the following illustration. I use this in groups many times. Suppose that you were asleep at night, and unknown to you, somebody came in your room and injected your arms with a drug so that you couldn't move them. You woke up in the morning and it was dark in your bedroom, and unknown to you, your arms were totally paralyzed, but you were unaware of the fact. You walk over to the wall, and you have it in your mind to turn the light switch on. You stand there next to the wall, and for the next few seconds, your body is totally motionless. But you have still performed a mental action. And the mental action was the following action: trying to bring it about that your arm moved to turn on the light. Trying to bring something about and endeavoring to move your arm to turn on the light. And it is that endeavoring that takes place inside the actor that is the volition, in the sense. Now, let's just summarize what we've said so far. Basically, what I've said is a property is a characteristic or attribute that something can have. A substance is something that can possess a property and remain the same through change. An event is a change of properties by a substance. Physical properties are what characterize physical substances or objects. Your brain is totally describable in terms of physical properties. It has a certain shape, mass, and so on, okay? Every state that goes on inside your brain from one moment to the next, every single state that takes place inside your brain could be captured through physical language, given the proper meters and measuring devices and that sort of thing. Now, the problem is, and we'll probe this a little bit more as the evening goes on, these appear to be very different kinds of realities. And basically, all of these presuppose consciousness. And that's the problem. And to put the matter quite simply, consciousness is not physical. And you cannot describe consciousness. Here's the problem for the physicalist. You cannot accurately describe consciousness if you're only limited to the vocabulary of physics, chemistry, and neurophysiology. You simply will not be able to capture the nature of sensations, thoughts, emotions, beliefs, desires, and acts of will. Now, may I give you one more principle? And I will summarize it. Then we can break up into our neighbor nudging groups. And some of you who had large dinners look like you're just about at the point where you need to be nudged. And so it'll be good timing. And then we'll, I know that feeling. And then we can have clarifying points or discussions as you wish. Or not because I think it's some big impressive thing to do, but just so you'll know the name. And it's called Leibniz's Law, after the Christian philosopher Leibniz. Of the indiscernibility of identicals. We could call this the law of identity for short. And it's so commonsensical that it's almost embarrassing for me to take time to tell it to you. Basically, the law of identity says everything is itself and not something else. What a country. It took me 3 years of graduate school to get this down. If Jacques Derrida could only get it down. He thinks nothing is identical to anything. That's his main problem. So every time a word is used again, it's a totally new word. Why he'd ever taken time to write a book or refer to an earlier chapter in a book would be beyond me, because it would have completely changed by the time he referred to it. And even the act of referring, which spans time, could no longer have the same intention with it as the act was completed as it did when the act began. That's a different subject. And I wish you'd stop making me go on these bunny trails. Okay. The law of identity basically says that if something X is identical to something Y, then whatever's true of X is true of Y, and whatever's true of Y is true of X. So if something X is identical to something Y, whatever is true of X is true of Y, and whatever is true of Y is true of X. Now let's just think about this. Many times we consider two different things, and we don't know if they're two things or if they're the same thing. Okay? Let's consider a substance. And let's consider the substance Jim McCann, who's an individual human person. And let's consider the substance the first president of the International School of Theology. And let's let X stand for Jim McCann, and let's let Y stand for the first president of the International School of Theology. Now, if X is identical to Y, that just means they're the same thing. There aren't two different persons. There's only one person. Jim McCann, who is the first president of the International School of Theology, who is identical to, who is the same thing as. Does that make sense to you? Now, if Jim McCann is identical to the first president of the International School of Theology, whatever's true of Jim McCann, suppose Jim McCann is 5'10", will be true of the first president of the International School of Theology, and vice versa. So if the first president of the School of Theology weighs 160 pounds, Jim McCann will weigh 160 pounds if Jim McCann is the first president of the School of Theology. Does that make sense to you? Now, if I were to be able to prove that there was one thing true of Jim McCann that wasn't true of the first president of the School of Theology, what could I show? They're not the same person. Now this is very important. What I'm about to tell you is very important. If I could just show that there was possibly something true of one that isn't true of the other, even if it isn't actually true of one, if I could just show that something could possibly be true of one that isn't true of the other, that would be enough to show they're not the same. Let me give you an example. If I could show that suppose that Jim McCann and the first president of the School of Theology both live in San Bernardino. And we don't know if they're the same or different right now. We just know that Jim McCann lives in San Bernardino and the first president of the School of Theology lives in San Bernardino. Now, even though they both live in San Bernardino, if it were possible that Jim McCann could live in Upland when the first president of the International School of Theology lived in San Bernardino, then even though it's not true that Jim McCann lives in Upland, that's still enough to show that they're not the same thing. Do you understand that? Because if X is identical to Y, it's not just that nothing's true of one that isn't true of the other, it's that nothing is possibly true of one that could be true of the other, because they're the same thing. You follow that? Now, this same law of identity will work for properties or events. Let's just talk about properties. Is the property called the color of the sky identical to the property of my wife's favorite color? Well, if they're the same color, if they're the same property, whatever's true of one will have to be true of the other. For example, they should both be lighter than purple and maybe darker than yellow. Does that make sense to you? If I could find one thing true of the color of the sky, which is a property, it's blue, that is not true of my wife's favorite color, I've shown that they are different properties. Okay? Okay, now, do you notice, listen very carefully now, do you notice that identity is not the same as cause and effect or dependence? Now, what do I mean by that? Well, identity is not the same thing as cause and effect. If just because X causes Y, that doesn't mean that X is identical to Y. Because fire causes smoke, but that doesn't mean fire is smoke. Does that make sense? Just because you can do something in someone's brain and they can't feel pain, it doesn't prove that that event that happened in the brain is identical to a feeling of pain. Okay? Now, just because X depends on Y to work, that doesn't prove X is Y. There are parts of a computer that depend upon other parts of the computer to work. But that doesn't prove that the one part of the computer is identical to the other parts of the computer. Does that make sense? Just because consciousness may depend upon certain chemical processes in the brain, that doesn't prove that consciousness is identical to those processes in the brain. You understand that? Now, let's break up into groups of, just around, try to feel the love if you can, and just hobnob and take about 5 minutes. Then we'll come back together and we'll go for another 10 minutes or so and take a break. Take about 5 minutes and rehearse what we've talked about. Testing 1, 2. Good. Can you hear me in the back? All right. Let's do this. Let's just take about 3, maybe 4 comments or questions. Then what I'd like to do is to build on this just a step further, and then I think we'll be ready for a break and ready to move into the second part. Yes?
When you were talking about X equals Y, yet if X causes Y to occur, that doesn't mean that X is equal to Y. I mean, it's two distinct things. I ran them together.
Okay.
Are you moving towards the physical chemistry of the brain and the fact that this starts this?
He's asking me why did I make the point about identity being different than cause and effect, and the answer is yes. The reason I'm doing the answer is yes. Now, what the heck did that mean? I mean, the answer. You be the judge. If your postmodernism is true, you're the one who constructs what I'm saying anyway. So, basically, all that scientists can show is a dependency of conscious states on brain states, and I might say to you, it can also be shown that it goes the other way around. There's clear evidence that the structure and the shape of your brain is dependent on your thought life. It goes both ways. But just because you can touch an electrode in someone's brain and cause a memory to appear, nothing interesting at all follows about the nature of that memory. It doesn't follow that it's in your brain. It doesn't follow it's a piece of your brain or a state of your brain or anything. And just because X causes Y, it doesn't show anything about the nature of X or the nature of Y. That's the main thing I'm trying to say. In the back. By the way I'm using sensation, is there a distinction between sensation and perception? It's kind of complicated, but yes, I would say perceptions are... Well, one of the I say that again. Yeah, yes. Yeah, that's a real problem. The argument is, well, gee, how can you know what physics and chemistry is about if you don't start with sensations? And of course, the point is, as I'll show later, the first-person point of view is prior to the third-person point of view. But they get rid of the first. B.F. Skinner basically denied the existence of consciousness. For Skinner, the essence of a pain, for B.F. Skinner, the only thing a pain is the tendency to shout ouch when you're stuck with a pen, which a computer that is totally dead and unconscious could do. And what was left out was the felt hurtfulness of pain. That did not exist for Skinner. Because he wanted to make psychology an empirical science that could be mathematicized and studied objectively, supposedly. So I think you're onto something. How about one more? 2 more, and then we'll stop with these brothers, or gentlemen anyway. Yes? question is the distinction here that one requires an agent and the other doesn't? I don't think so, because you can have hallucinatory empirical sensations for which there's no agent. So I wouldn't say that. By an empirical sensation, I simply mean things like hearing sounds, seeing shapes or colors, smelling things, tasting or feeling. And by non-empirical, frankly, most of the non-empirical sensations are things that are totally within you, like pains and feelings that that you're not tempted to think are about something outside of you. Not necessarily, because I could, if I wished to, conjure up a pain. I could cause myself to feel pain. And through the use of the mind, I could actually make something feel itchy to me, I think. One more. Yes. Well, that's a question for a different time, I think, if you don't mind. Yeah, I'd rather stick with the mind issue. That's a very good question. And if you'd like to talk to me at the break, why don't you do that? Why don't we talk about that at the break? Okay, what I'd like to do now is just to try to explain now this chart, and then we'll go to break, and hopefully you'll be in a position to get the issues clear. Suppose that you get stuck with a pin and something happens inside you, and let's call that a pain event. You're stuck with a pin and a pain event occurs inside you. Okay? And that pain event involves you having the property of painfulness. Okay? Now, one of the limitations of the evening is I'm going to have to deal with only a certain form of physicalism, and the problem is there are different versions, and I just can't cover them all this evening. So I'm going to have to just cut this a little bit, make this a little simplistic. Forgive me for that. Those of you who know a little bit more about the subject, cut me a little rope here. But basically, how would a physicalist describe what has happened to you if you've been stuck with a pin? Well, here's what the physicalist would say. The physicalist would say that there is a substance called your brain. And that substance has had a property that has now occurred in it. And so let's just say that this property is now possessed by the brain. Now, what exactly is that property? Well, it's the property of a C fiber firing pattern. So you're stuck with a pin, and a certain event happens in your what? Scientists can describe that event using the language of neurophysiology, and the event will be called having the property of a certain C fiber pattern firing. And this will involve certain kinds of synapses and certain kinds of electrical sparkings that will jump across those synapses, and it will involve a certain flow of potassium ions and a whole number of different chemical and physical events. Now, This is what the property is. Okay? Now, scientists use the term C-fiber firing to describe this property. That's the term that the scientist uses to describe this physical property in the brain. Average folks use the term pain. This is the common sense term. Okay? Now, are these the same terms? No. But they do refer to the very same property on this view. And what is the essence of the property? What exactly is the correct description of the property? It's the one that the brain scientist gives you. If you wanted to describe that event, you could do it completely in the terms of the physical sciences. Okay? Now, do you understand that two terms can refer to the same object? You understand that? So the term evening star and morning star both refer to the planet Venus. They're not the same term, are they? So the terms are different, but we've got the same thing. So now, according to the physicalist, when you're stuck with a pin, there is one substance, and that's your brain. And it comes to possess a property. And when it comes to possess the property, a brain event occurs after being stuck. So you're stuck with a pin, and an event happens in the brain. And that event involves a physical property taking place in your brain. What is that property? Well, we've learned it's a certain C-fiber firing pattern that takes place at that moment after you're stuck. There are different ways of talking about that property. The scientists have a precise, accurate, technical way of talking about it. Average folks use what are called folk psychology. This is the term that's often used. Folk psychology, it's a common sense term. But when they're using the term pain, what they're really talking about, but they had to wait until 1950 to find out, was what they're talking about is a C-fiber firing pattern, and that's the end of it. That's what the physicalists will hold. Now, it gets more complicated, but at the end of the day, this is the story that is told. Now, the property dualist. Now, let me ask you this. What is the relationship? Do you realize that this term pain refers to something? Right? It refers to what's happening in the brain. This term, C-fiber firing, refers to something. It refers to what happens in the brain. Is that right? What is the relationship between pain and C-fiber firing? What's the relationship? Identity. It's the same property. So that means whatever's true of this is true of that, or vice versa. Because these two terms, this is X and this is Y, and X is identical to Y on this particular view we're talking about. Does it make sense to you at this point? Now, the property dualist comes along and says, I'm not buying here. The property dualist says, there's good news and there's bad news, Mr. Physicalist. The property dualist says, I agree that there is only one substance, and that's the brain. So when you're stuck with a pin, something happens inside the brain and nowhere else. But when you're stuck with a pin, two different properties occur in the brain at the same time. The first property that occurs in the brain is a C-fiber firing property. So if you're stuck with a brain and if you're stuck with a pin, you made me do that again, sir. Now, okay, if you're stuck with a pin, and we have a meter, or we're somehow measuring the activities in your brain, we will be able to measure that after that pin prick, there was a certain physically describable property that occurred at a certain area of your brain. So far, so good. But now there's another property that takes place, and that property is the property of painfulness. And according to the property dualist, These are not the same property. They're different. And the property dualist says the reason they're different is because there's something true of this that isn't true of that, and there's something true of that that isn't true of this. What that is, we'll talk about later. Well, then what's the relationship between these for the property dualist? Cause and effect. This property is the cause, and when the brain comes to have this property, it causes the brain to come to have this property. You understand that? Okay. So on this view now, there is one and only one possessor of all the properties. It's the brain. The brain is the possessor of all the physical states that go on inside of it. You understand that? And the brain is the possessor of your conscious states as well. But your conscious states are not the same thing as your brain states, but they may be caused by the brain states. What the physicalist wants to do is to say that your conscious states, your sensations, your thoughts, your beliefs, your desires, your acts of will, turn out just to be events in the brain that cause your body to behave in certain ways, or something like that. The property dualist wants to say one possessor, but two very different sets of properties that cause things to one another. So far, so good? Now, the substance dualist comes along and says, you got basically the whole thing wrong. You're half right, and here's the correct story, says the substance dualist. And basically, the substance dualist says there are two things. First of all, there is a brain. And then, by thing, remember, I mean possessors. Then there is a self, or an ego, or an I. An I, or an ego, or a self. Now, by an ego, of course, I don't mean somebody who's got pride problems here, though that may very well be the case, too. Okay? Now, when you're stuck with a pin, your brain comes to have a certain property in it that could be observed by the proper instrumentation, and it will be a brain event. And what that might do is it's going to cause a conscious event to take place in the ego, or the self, or the I. Okay? And that will be a pain event. Now, there may be a cause-effect relationship. Maybe the brain event caused the pain event. Similarly, if I have a mental event in my mind of worrying, that might cause a brain event of losing norepinephrine, a brain chemical. So now notice, the substance dualist is a property dualist. You see that? The substance dualist agrees that there is a dualism of properties, but she wants to go on and insist that there's also a dualism of possessors of the relevant properties. There are different owners of these properties. So not only are my conscious states not my brain states, but I am not my brain. Let's take a 15... Greg Kokel needs to come up and make an announcement, and then we'll take a break.